Lucille Ball is sitting across from Johnny Carson on the Tonight Show stage for what she already knows will be the last time, and what she slips into his hand under the desk, a small sealed envelope she has been carrying for 11 years, will make Johnny go completely still in his chair, mid-sentence, mid-breath, in a way no one in that studio has ever seen before. The secret inside that envelope was something America never knew, something that Lucille Ball carried alone for more than a decade. Something that, when it finally came out, would rewrite everything the world thought it understood about the funniest woman who ever lived. You will not believe what happens next. But before starting our video, I'd like to say something. I often see comments from people who did not realize they were not subscribed. If you enjoy the channel, please take a second to check and make sure you are subscribed. It is free, and it really helps us keep the show growing. Thank you for being part of this journey with us. It was September 4th, 1974, The Tonight Show, NBC Studios, Burbank, California. Stage 1 was packed with 320 people who had been waiting in line since 3 in the afternoon. The warm-up comedian had already worked the crowd into a pleasant, expectant hum. The studio lights blazed down on the familiar set, the desk, the couch, the curtain, with the rainbow of city lights glowing behind it. Everything was exactly as it always was. Everything looked normal. And that was the last normal thing about that night. Lucille Ball arrived at the studio at 4:15 in the afternoon. Her call time was 4:45. Nobody on the Tonight Show staff had ever seen her arrive early, not once. In 22 years of television, Lucille Ball was many things. Punctual? Yes, but never early. Early meant you had nowhere else to be. Early meant something was pushing you toward a door you needed to walk through. The makeup artist, a woman named Gloria Tennyson, who had worked the Tonight Show chair for 9 years, noticed it immediately. She noticed the way Lucille sat down without speaking, which was unusual. She noticed the way Lucille's hands stayed folded in her lap instead of gesturing the way they always gestured. And she noticed the small envelope. It was cream-colored, maybe 3 inches by 5, sealed. Lucille held it in her left hand the entire time Gloria worked on her face. She didn't put it down. She didn't look at it. She just held it. The way a person holds a thing they are afraid to set down because setting it down makes it too real. Gloria asked about it once, just gently, "What's that?" Lucille looked at the envelope in her hand as though she had briefly forgotten it was there. Then she looked up at Gloria in the mirror and said 4 words that Gloria Tennyson would repeat in a private interview 17 years later, when the full story finally came out. Something I should have said. Then she didn't say anything else, and Gloria didn't ask again. But what nobody in that makeup room knew, what nobody in the entire building knew, except Lucille Ball herself, was what was inside that envelope, and the reason she had carried it, sealed and unread by anyone but her, for 11 years. 11 years of telling herself she would send it someday. 11 years of keeping it in the top left drawer of her desk at Desilu, then at her home office in Beverly Hills. 11 years of picking it up, turning it over, putting it back, and now she was here. Because she had run out of time to keep waiting for the right moment. The right moment, she had finally understood, was the one you made yourself. Wait, do not miss this detail. Because the story of that envelope does not begin in 1974. It begins in 1963. And it begins not with laughter, but with the specific silence that comes after a life falls apart. 1963. Lucille Ball was 52 years old, and by every measurement that Hollywood used to evaluate a woman in show business, she was finished. The divorce from Desi Arnaz had been finalized 3 years earlier. The marriage that had produced the most watched television program in American history had ended in the kind of mutual wreckage that left both parties permanently altered. I Love Lucy had ended. Desilu Productions, the studio she had built from nothing, was hers now to run alone, which meant she spent most of her days managing budgets, negotiating contracts, and managing the particular loneliness that comes from being both the most powerful woman in a room and the only person in that room who was once also the most beloved. She had a new show. The Lucy Show had debuted in 1962 and was performing well by any reasonable standard. The ratings were strong, the reviews were kind, CBS was happy. But Lucille Ball was not happy, and she was too intelligent not to know the difference. The Lucy Show was good television. I Love Lucy had been something else entirely. Something she could not fully articulate, something that had come from inside a marriage, and a partnership, and a creative combustion that no amount of professionalism could replicate. She knew it, and knowing it was its own kind of grief. She was also alone in ways the public never saw. Her children, Lucy and Desi Jr., were teenagers navigating their own version of their parents' collapse. The friendships she had built over 2 decades in Hollywood had sorted themselves, the way friendships do after a divorce, into his and hers. She had her work, and she had her discipline, and she had the armor she had been building since childhood, since Jamestown, New York, since a father who died of typhoid fever when she was 3 years old, and a mother who worked constantly, and a childhood that had taught her early and permanently that the only reliable thing in any room was her own performance. And then, on a Tuesday night in October of 1963, something happened that Lucille Ball never planned for. She was in her home office. Late, 11:30, maybe midnight. She had been working through Desilu production schedules for the following quarter, the kind of work that required attention, and rewarded it with exhaustion. She had the television on in the background, not watching it, just the sound, because the silence in that house had weight to it, the kind of weight you feel in the chest. The Tonight Show was on. Johnny Carson was hosting. He was doing an interview with a guest she didn't register, but then the guest segment ended and Johnny turned to the camera and did something she had seen him do dozens of times. But that night landed differently. He talked directly to the audience, not at them, not performing at them. He looked straight into the lens and said something quiet and specific about the feeling of working very hard at something, and still suspecting, in the private hours, that it was not enough. Lucille Ball set down her papers. She wasn't sure why. She had heard monologues. She had heard confessions on television. She had heard performers tell their truths in ways designed to make you feel something. This was different. Johnny Carson was not performing his uncertainty. He was reporting it, the way a person reports a weather condition. Matter of fact, unguarded, with none of the usual comedic cushion that let you observe pain from a safe distance. Lucille watched him for the next 20 minutes, without moving. When the show ended, she sat in her office for a long time. Then she opened the top drawer of her desk and took out a piece of stationery. She wrote 1 page. She sealed it in a cream-colored envelope. She addressed it to Johnny Carson, NBC Studios, Burbank. And then she did not send it. She put it back in the drawer. Because there are things you write and things you send, and sometimes the act of writing is enough. Sometimes. She told herself she would send it when the time was right. She told herself that for 11 years. But what nobody knew, what even Lucille Ball herself would not fully understand until much later, was that the letter she wrote that night was not simply a thank you note. It was something far more precise, far more honest, and far more dangerous to say out loud. September 4th, 1974, 5:45 p.m. Burbank. Johnny Carson was in his dressing room 20 minutes before the show began, when there was a knock at the door. Not the stage manager's knock, which was 3 quick raps. This was 2 knocks, a pause, then 1 more, deliberate, almost formal. Johnny opened the door. Lucille Ball stood in the hallway in the floral blazer she would wear on stage. That night, her hair the famous red, her expression composed in the way that very controlled people compose their expressions when they are not entirely composed. She was holding the envelope. Johnny looked at her face, then at the envelope, then back at her face. He had known Lucille Ball for 15 years in the way people in the same industry know each other, through shared spaces and mutual admiration, and the particular shorthand of 2 people who had both spent their lives making other people laugh. He had interviewed her 4 times. He had watched her work. He had a profound and genuine respect for what she could do in front of a camera, but he had never seen her look like this. He stepped back from the door without saying anything. She walked in. He closed the door behind her. They spoke for 11 minutes. The stage manager knocked once. Johnny said, through the door, "Give us a moment, please." When they emerged, a crew member named Patrick Riley, who had worked The Tonight Show for 6 years, said that the hallway felt different afterward. He could not explain what he meant by that, but insisted on it in the years that followed. The hallway felt like something had been released into it. The shows began at 6 p.m. for broadcast at 11:30. Johnny's monologue that night was precise, not his best, not his worst. The kind of performance that only people who had watched him for years would recognize as slightly subdued. The jokes landing cleanly, but without the usual extra centimeter of joy in the delivery. Ed McMahon knew. Ed always knew. He glanced at Johnny twice. during the monologue, with that specific look he reserved for the moments when something was happening under the surface of the show that the audience could not see. During the first commercial break, Ed leaned in. "Johnny, what's going on?" Johnny looked at him for a moment. He said 5 words that Ed McMahon would not repeat publicly for more than 20 years. "Lucy's going to say something." Ed started to ask what that meant. Johnny had already turned back to the camera. At 6:42 p.m., Lucille Ball walked out from behind the curtain. The audience response was immediate and enormous. 320 people on their feet before she reached the desk, because that was what Lucille Ball did to a room. She did not simply enter it. She completed it, the way the last piece of a structure locks everything else into place. She was 62 years old. She moved like a woman who had never had any doubts about exactly where she was going. She shook Johnny's hand, settled into the guest chair, looked at the audience with that expression that contained multitudes, warmth and wind, and a half-second of challenge, and the promise of something the audience could not quite name yet. The interview began normally. Johnny asked about her new projects. She answered, in the way she always answered, precisely and dryly, and with the timing that had been refined over 4 decades of practice until it looked entirely effortless. The audience laughed in all the right places. Everything looked like every other Lucille Ball interview, on every other late-night show. But Johnny's hands were not quite still, and Lucille Ball's left hand was below the desk, where the camera could not see it, holding the cream-colored envelope. Wait, do not miss this. What happened next had never happened in the entire history of The Tonight Show, and it started with the smallest possible gesture, the kind you would miss if you blinked. 12 minutes into the interview, during a moment when the audience was still riding the tail of a laugh, Lucille Ball reached across the space between them and placed the envelope on Johnny Carson's side of the desk. Not on camera, not dramatically. With the quiet efficiency of a person completing an action they have been rehearsing for 11 years. Johnny felt it before he saw it. He looked down. He looked at the envelope. He looked at Lucille Ball. His expression shifted so completely and so quickly that the camera operator, working purely on instinct, zoomed in. "Johnny," Lucille said, in a voice that was quieter than her interview voice. "Dear Johnny, I want you to read that later, but I need you to know what it says while I'm still sitting here. So I need to tell you first." The audience had gone still. Not silent yet, because people were still sorting out what was happening, whether this was a bit, whether the punchline was coming. But still, Johnny Carson set his index card down. He folded his hands on the desk, and he looked at Lucille Ball with total, complete attention. The audience understood then. This was not a bit. In October of 1963, Lucille said, "I was in my office very late. I had the television on. I wasn't watching it. And you were on. And you said something. And I stopped what I was doing, and I listened to you for 20 minutes straight, without moving." She paused. "I want you to know what that meant, what that actually meant. Not professionally, not in terms of show business, personally." The studio was silent. 320 people who had come to laugh were sitting perfectly still. "I had been alone for 3 years by then," Lucille continued. "Not just unmarried, alone in the way that I think you understand. The way you are alone when you have spent your entire life performing, and you wake up one morning and realize that the performance and the person have become impossible to tell apart. I didn't know who I was when there was no audience. I genuinely didn't know." Johnny Carson said nothing. His jaw was tight. His eyes were on her face. And that night, Lucille said, "You talked about working very hard at something and still not being sure it was enough. And you weren't being funny about it. You were just saying it. Out loud. On television. In front of everyone." She looked at her hands for a moment. Then back at Johnny. "I wrote you a letter that night. That letter. I told you that watching you be uncertain without apologizing. For it was the first time in 3 years that I felt like a human being instead of a performance. That's what I wrote. I wrote that your honesty that night gave me permission to not know what I was doing, that it saved something in me that I had been very quietly losing." The audience did not make a sound. Not one person moved. "And I didn't send it," Lucille said, "because I was embarrassed, because Lucille Ball does not write letters like that to people. Lucille Ball handles things. Lucille Ball is fine." She paused, and something crossed her face that the cameras caught. Something unguarded. Something that did not look like the woman from the posters. "I've been handling things my whole life, Johnny. I'm 62 years old, and I'm tired of handling things and not saying them." Johnny Carson's head dropped forward. His hand pressed flat on the desk. When he raised his head, his eyes were wet. The audience broke not into applause, into the specific sound of 320 people quietly coming undone. He picked up the envelope. He held it the way people hold things they understand to be irreplaceable. "Lucy," he said. His voice was not quite steady. His voice, which had been steady on camera for 12 years, was not quite steady. "Can I ask you something?" She nodded. "Do you remember what I was talking about that night? The specific thing?" She looked at him. "October 14th, 1963. You had just come back from a week off. You talked about the show going through a rough patch, about whether the format was sustainable, about whether you were the right person for the job." She paused. "You said you weren't sure anyone was watching who actually needed what you were doing. You said that was the hardest part." Johnny was very still for a moment. "I remember that night," he said quietly. "I remember it because I almost didn't say any of that. I had written jokes. I had the cards. And then I just set them down, and I said what was actually true. And I went home convinced I had made a terrible mistake, that I had been too real, that it was unprofessional." He looked at her. "I almost apologized for it the next night." Lucille Ball's eyes were glistening. "Please don't ever apologize for that," she said. The silence in the studio held for a long time. Long enough that the director in the control room would later say it was the longest silence he had ever let ride in 12 years of live television. Because cutting it would have been like cutting a wire that was holding something essential in place. What happened next is what nobody planned, and nobody could have planned. Johnny Carson stood up from his chair. He walked around the desk to where Lucille Ball was sitting. He sat on the edge of the desk, facing her, the way you sit when the chairs and the furniture and the careful blocking of television no longer feel relevant. He held the envelope in his hand. "I've been doing this show for 12 years, he said, talking to her but also to the room, to the cameras, to 28 million people who would watch this broadcast when it aired at 11:30. And the thing I forget, the thing I keep forgetting, is that the most important moments are not the jokes. They are not the bits. They are the 30 seconds when I say something true, and I don't dress it up, and someone, somewhere, in an office at midnight, stops what they are doing and listens." He looked at Lucille. "You just told me that actually happened. You just told me that the thing I was most afraid of, being too real, too unguarded, too much, was the exact thing that reached you." He paused. "I don't know what to do with that except say thank you for telling me. After 11 years, you didn't have to. You could have kept that letter forever, and I never would have known. But you came here tonight, and you said it out loud." He looked at the envelope in his hand. "And I'm going to read every word of this, and I am going to keep it, because this is the kind of thing that reminds you why you get up and do the job." Lucille Ball reached up and took his hand for a moment. The camera caught it. Just that. Just two people who had made the world laugh for a combined 60 years, holding hands on a television stage while a studio full of strangers wept quietly. Ed McMahon, who had been on this show since the beginning, who had seen every kind of moment that a live television stage could produce, pressed his hand over his eyes and did not lower it for a very long time. That is what nobody had seen coming. That is what nobody could have scripted. But what nobody in that studio knew, what would not come out until years later, was that the letter contained something beyond what Lucille had said on air, something more specific, something that explained not just why that October night in 1963 had mattered, but why she had waited 11 years to say so. And when Johnny Carson finally read it, alone in his car in the NBC parking lot after the broadcast, he sat there for 45 minutes without driving anywhere. The crew of The Tonight Show said that Lucille Ball lingered after the cameras stopped. She did not rush to leave, the way guests often did. She sat with Johnny at the desk for several minutes after the broadcast ended. The stage lights dimmed to their between-segment level. The audience was filing out slowly, many of them still quiet. A woman near the back was crying. Two men near the aisle were not speaking, just walking, with the particular silence of people who have heard something they need to carry home and sit with. Gloria Tennyson, the makeup artist, was standing in the wings. She said that watching them sit at that desk in the dimming light, long after the cameras had stopped rolling, felt like watching two people reach the end of a very long walk and finally sit down. She said she didn't go in to do touch-ups. She said it would have felt like interruption. The broadcast aired at 11:30 that night. By 11:52, The Tonight Show switchboard was overwhelmed. Not with celebrity gossip, not with complaints, not with the usual mix of commentary and praise, with people calling to talk about their own letters, their own envelopes, their own 11 years of waiting for the right moment to say the thing they had written down and never sent. A woman in Cincinnati called to say she had a letter to her father that she had written in 1967 and had carried in her purse ever since. A man in Denver called to say he had written a letter to his best friend the night the friend's wife left and had never given it to him because it had seemed too private. A school teacher in Atlanta called to say she had shown her class a clip of a Tonight Show episode the previous year, a specific episode where Johnny had talked about doubt, and that 3 of her students had come to her afterward and told her things they had never told anyone. By 2 a.m., every line was still busy. The following Monday, Lucille Ball sent a handwritten note to the Tonight Show production office, addressed to the entire crew. 2 sentences. The first thanked them for making a space where something true could happen. The second was a quote she attributed to no one in particular, though the Tonight Show archivist would later trace it to a letter she had written, and apparently crossed out in the margins of a production schedule from 1964. It read, "The things we don't say become the weight we carry. Eventually the weight is heavier than the saying would have been." Johnny Carson kept the cream-colored envelope. He kept it in the same wooden box, where he kept the crumpled State Fair paper from Tim Conway, the folded letter he would one day receive from another friend, the small accumulated archive of the moments that the cameras had caught, but that no broadcast had ever fully contained. Years later, a producer who worked closely with Carson in his final years on the show said that Johnny talked about the Lucille Ball broadcast more than almost any other. Not the famous moments, not the legendary guests, not the moments that had made the highlight reels for 30 years. The Lucille Ball broadcast, September 4th, 1974. The producer asked him what specifically he remembered. Johnny thought about it, he said. She carried something for 11 years, because she was afraid of what saying it would cost her. And then she said it anyway, and it cost her nothing, and it gave me everything. He paused. I think about that a lot, he said. The things we carry, because we are afraid of what the saying will cost, and how almost always we are wrong about the price. Lucille Ball continued working until her health made it impossible. She appeared on television, hosted, produced, managed, performed with the same precision and ferocity that had defined her for 4 decades. She rarely spoke publicly about the September 1974 broadcast, but in a private interview conducted in 1987, 2 years before her death, a journalist who had been a friend for many years asked her if there was a single professional decision she was most proud of. Lucille was quiet for a moment. She said, "I went to NBC one afternoon and I said something true on camera. That's the one. Not I Love Lucy, not Desilu, not any of the awards." That afternoon, the journalist asked why. "Because I almost didn't," Lucille said. "Because Lucille Ball doesn't do that. Lucille Ball handles things. And I did it anyway. And it mattered. And that's the whole job. That's all any of it is ever for." Lucille Ball died on April 26, 1989. She was 77 years old. The tributes that followed were enormous, and justly so. They spoke of her talent, her timing, her business acumen, her trailblazing presence in an industry that had never known quite what to do with a woman as capable as she was. They spoke of Lucy Ricardo. They spoke of Desilu. They spoke of the empire she built and the legacy she left. Very few of them mentioned September 4th, 1974. But in the weeks after her death, something quiet happened. Dozens of letters arrived at the Tonight Show production office addressed to Johnny Carson. Letters from people who had watched that broadcast 15 years earlier. Letters from people who had gone home that night and found their own envelopes in their own drawers. Letters from people who had picked up the phone the next morning and made a call they had been postponing for years. Letters from people who had, in the specific language of one writer from Portland, Oregon, decided that if Lucille Ball could say the things she was afraid to say, then so could they. Johnny Carson answered every one of those letters personally. His assistant confirmed it years later. He answered every single one. When Johnny Carson retired from The Tonight Show in 1992, he gave an interview in which he said that the job had taught him one thing above all others. One thing that superseded jokes and timing and ratings and legacy. He said, "The moments that matter are the ones when someone stops performing and starts telling the truth. Every time that happened on my stage, every time someone sat in that chair and said the thing they had been carrying, something changed in the room. You could feel it. 300 people would go quiet in exactly the same way, and you would think, this is what it's all for. Not the ratings, not the Emmy, this. He was asked if there was one guest, one moment, that defined that for him most clearly. He said, Lucille Ball, September 4th, 1974. She handed me an envelope, and she told me what was in it, and she was terrified the entire time. I could see it, and she did it anyway. That's courage, not the big dramatic kind, the quiet kind. The kind where you've been carrying something for 11 years, and you decide that today is finally the day you set it down. He paused for a long time before he said the last thing. I still have the envelope, he said. I will have it until the day I die. He did. When Johnny Carson passed away on January 23, 2005, the wooden box was among the personal effects his family documented. Inside it, among the small, carefully kept archive of the moments that had mattered most, was a cream-colored envelope, 3 inches by 5, handwritten, sealed originally in 1963 and opened only once, in a parking lot in Burbank on the night of September 4, 1974. His family said that the letter inside was one page, that it was handwritten in Lucille Ball's precise and distinctive hand, that it had been folded and unfolded enough times over the years that the creases had worn soft, and that at the bottom of the page, below the signature, in handwriting slightly different from the rest, as though added later, perhaps much later, were 4 words. Thank you for staying. If this story moved you, do one thing before you close this video. Think of the letter you haven't sent, the phone call you haven't made, the thing you wrote down or thought through or almost said, and then decided to keep carrying, because saying it felt too expensive. Think of how long you've been carrying it, and ask yourself what Lucille Ball asked herself in the fall of 1974, standing at a crossroads between the weight of silence and the cost of truth. Ask yourself which is actually heavier. Subscribe so you never miss these stories. Share this with someone who is still carrying something they should have said. And drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. Because this story is reaching people everywhere, and I want to know where it's landing. Because somewhere right now, someone is looking at an envelope they sealed 11 years ago. Tell them it's time. Tell them the cost is not what they think. Tell them that on a Tuesday in September of 1974, the funniest woman in the world walked onto a television stage with her hands shaking and her heart in a 3x5 envelope and said the thing she was most afraid to say. And it cost her nothing. And it gave someone everything.